inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them, the supply side and the demand side. Both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that, the breakdown of the supply chain, partly related to energy, partly related to the war in Ukraine, partly related to the pandemic panic. It actually predates that. The breakdown started in 2018 with Trump's trade war. And then COVID made it worse, yes. Ukrainian war made it worse, yes. But it really started before that. And, bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing. And that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up and, people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, and I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons. This is where now, I criticize Powell enough. Let's criticize Wall Street for a minute. So the Wall Street narrative is, we're there. Job creation is slow. Wage growth is slowed in real terms. It has. Labor force participation is not going up, at least not, just noise, kind of on a month-to-month basis. And the Fed's going to get the message. You're going to stop raising rates, soft landing, Goldilocks, and then they're going to cut rates, so buy tech stocks. That's kind of how Wall Street thinks. They're just trying to sell you some tech stocks. They're wrong too. Powell's wrong for the reasons I mentioned. Wall Street's got it wrong too, because inflation is coming down. That's empirical. There's no debate about that. But it's coming down for really bad reasons, which is the economy is hitting the wall. And not just the U.S. This is a global phenomenon. We're looking at a global recession. For a major economy, the U.S. or China or EU, UK, whatever, to go into recession, it happens. And then somebody else has growth and they kind of pull everybody out of the ditch. But a global recession is highly unusual. And that appears to be what we're heading for. Oh, the other thing where the cheerleaders are out is the China reopening story. So they spent 3 years basically putting people in concentration camps, quarantine lockdowns, no travel. The examples of people, in hazmat suits welding steel bars in front of apartments so people couldn't get out because they had COVID, and they're jumping out of windows and killing themselves. Testing tents every 2 blocks. You had to be tested 3 times a week, etc. Now that we got past the 20th National Party Congress and Xi is, I call him Chairman Xi, is now emperor for life, which he is. They can kind of leave that behind. They pivoted. They say, okay, now we're just going to let it rip. We're just going to let it rip. That's the new policy. But he just wanted to get the 3rd term under his belt before they let the thing rip. But what does let it rip mean? It's 1.4 billion people. So if you assume a 30% infection rate, which is probably low, it could well be 50%, but even 30%, that's 420 million infections. And if you assume a low fatality rate, 1/4%, and that's probably low, that's between 1 and 2 million dead. And not only that, they don't have the hospital facility. Now, US, UK, Europe had to power through it. And I'm a little critical of Boris Johnson, but to his credit, he did end the extreme lockdown earlier, which was a very smart thing to do. And UK got to something like herd immunity sooner than the rest of the world. So I think the UK got that. Everybody got it wrong at the beginning. It was a question of when were you going to wake up. And the UK, I think, did a better job of that than a lot. US finally got there. Europe finally got there. But we did have the hospital facility. They were taxed. There were people waiting, but we managed to it. China isn't even close. They don't have the beds, ICU facilities. They don't have the oxygen. And back to the supply chain for 1 second, you cannot get Tamiflu. You cannot get ibuprofen. You cannot get cough medicine. This is over-the-counter drugs. Those shelves are bare. Why? The answer is 80 to 90% of it comes from China. And the Chinese know that when you have 420 million infections and you don't have a hospital facility, they're going to have to self-medicate. So they are stripping the shelves bare on their side. They're buying all the ibuprofen, the Tamiflu, and everything else. So they don't have anything to ship to us. A case study in dependency, but also shows how the supply chain dysfunction continues. So Wall Street's saying, well, now that you're going to let it rip, you'll be over it in a few weeks, and they're reopened to travel, people are going back to China, et cetera. No, I mean, those things are happening, but China, first of all, the 8 to 10 weeks, and I identified this based on the work of an Israeli statistician who in early 2020, and he said they run 8 to 10 weeks. And it was a very valuable predictive analytic tool throughout the whole thing, because you could say, when Delta hit in December 2020, I said it'll be over by February, and it was. And when Omicron hit a year later, I said it'll be over by February, and it was. But the problem with that's a good tool, but that's in a locality, New York City or Milan or London, et cetera. But that doesn't mean it won't pop up in another locality with its own 8 to 10 week run and keep going around the country. And that's what Wall Street's missing. They're like, oh, this thing will be over by February. Well, maybe in Shanghai or Ningbo, but it hasn't really got to the countryside yet. Maybe 8 to 10 weeks in a locality doesn't mean that hundreds of thousands of people don't die, but that's going to keep popping up all over the country. So this is going to last a year or more, number one. Well, the virus mutates, we know that, but often the mutation is to a more harmless form, but not always. And it can mutate into a more lethal, contagious form. And there's something called recombination, where the DNA of 2 different strains actually merge and you get kind of a super version of the bug. And then heaven help us if that goes around the world again, we're back where we were in 2020. So the Chinese reopening story is a myth, at least in the short run. They've got problems that have nothing to do with COVID. Real estate collapse, too much debt, demographic problems, et cetera, corruption, and a lot else besides. So you're looking at a global recession, a severe one. Powell's making it worse with his interest rate hikes. They'll get inflation under control, but for all the wrong reasons, which is we're in a really bad recession.